Hello, my name is James Payne, and I'm a PhD candidate at MIT Sloan School of Management in the System Dynamics group. And today I'm here to present my ongoing research on model-based and model-free cost reductions in a simulated multi-echelon supply chain. And a big part of this really ties into some of my ongoing research in the field of behavioral operations management. Now, behavioral operations management as a sort of subspecialty has really exploded in the last few years, both in terms of popularity and in terms of definition of the field itself. These are just a few of sort of the papers over the last few years that have worked on both establishing BOM within sort of the larger OM and OR communities. And also there's a few pieces in here that directly connect behavioral operations management to system dynamics as well, notably a chapter in the Handbook of Behavioral Operations. And additionally, some pieces in here talking about using system dynamics as sort of a structural language for behavioral operations problems. And really what ties system dynamics and behavioral operations together is sort of this recognition that supply chains exist for often non-rational entities, people. And incorporation of these behavioral decision-making features is beneficial to these operations models. So my question here is sort of, can we describe this value a little bit more directly? Can we sort of enumerate what is the value of incorporating behavioral features into these models? And really, what is the boundary? When is a model-based policy preferred over possibly a model-free method? Now, when I say model-based versus model-free, really what am I talking about here? So when we say model-based, there's some direct papers here that use models in decision-making processes, but then some more recent ones talk about sort of coming up with heuristic models to describe how individuals make decisions in these operations management spaces. But really, we can be a little bit more direct. We could say that most of sort of the material within one of the seminal textbooks from this field is based around incorporating models in decision processes. But then additionally, like really fundamental control theory is using some sort of model in order to make a decision. Now, when we talk about model-free approaches, what we're talking about there is really concepts that were introduced and popularized in the late 90s and early 2000s in the form of sort of reinforcement learning. In this case, you are taking sort of repeated interactions with your environment and directly coming up with a relationship between the value that you receive and the action you take, independent of the actual environment in which you're in. And of course, there's been some more recent work that actually directly applies this to operations management settings. And of course, some tools that have popularized this beyond just academic circles, as TensorFlow, OpenAI Gym, and PyTorch as some examples. So this work right here is really talking about what can we do to explore the boundary between these two approaches and perhaps even take it away altogether. So the basis for this is really looking at these concepts around bullwhip. Well, at least that's the functional testing bed for the research here. And I think this will be review for this audience. But when I say bullwhip, what I mean is as you move further and further away from some sort of perturbation in your signal, as you move further along an inventory and supply chain management system, that perturbation gets both amplified and shifted through time. And that's really bullwhip is this idea of amplification and phase shift over time. And we've talked about bullwhip now for quite some time. And it's persistent in a multitude of different configurations of supply chains and industries. And I think the last few years have illustrated that quite nicely. And it's also persistently observable and arguably quite behavioral in its origins. But there's also been some model-free approaches towards mitigating bullwhip lately that don't necessarily rely on having an underlying model of human decision-making. So for more of a direct framework, this work utilizes the beer game. This is some pictures of the beer game from a few years ago, pre-pandemic, as done at MIT. But just because of sort of pandemic restrictions doesn't mean that we stopped doing it. Here's some pictures from our most recent run using an online version and sort of a hybrid setup here off to the side that's in person, still utilizes it. And we still get these classic features of bullwhip amplification and phase shift within that space. So really what this work is talking about is how can we take sort of a model of real human orders of real people making decisions in the space and possibly introduce an agent into one of these positions that's making a decision either using a model of the environment in which it exists or is making a decision sort of independent of any sort of model of the environment in which it exists in an effort to reduce the costs across the supply chain while still letting those other entities act like or even be real human players. So first step was to create this sort of modular version of the beer game. It's a discrete time simulation. It's modularized to allow for multiple different ordering rules that have been found in prior behavioral research. This is just one example here. It's the classic Sturman 89 rule, just sort of laid out explicitly on the slide. So ultimately how this system works is you have sort of a simulated model with a time delay of people making decisions, and those decisions in turn affecting the decisions that other players are making in the space, given how that affects sort of the state of your system. Again, right now the Sturman 89 rule is shown in this slide, but it really, based upon how this is coded, could be modularized to sort of any behavioral ordering rule, or even sort of semi-rational rule like a base stock order policy. So as sort of a baseline, this is sort of some examples of some baseline behavior that from the simulation is able to recreate the spaceship, the application behavior. And now we can go into sort of a first attempt at a mitigating entity, some sort of agent that can act in the space. And so this is what I term a single shot cost reduction policy. In this case, for fix some entity in your position. So this is a 4-entity supply chain. So pick one. So let's just say like entity number 2, and then go ahead and try to vary the values of the decision rule that that entity would make. So in this case, if it's utilizing Sturman's 1989 decision heuristic, pick sort of physically feasible values of these 4 parameters of that rule, that would result in a cost reduced outcome while allowing the other 3 entities to make the decisions they would have otherwise. And in general, even when we sort of determine this rule for sort of an aggregate level, so we've come up with sort of by position the 4 parameters that are cost reducing on average, you end up getting some nice cost reductions when applied in some different environments. What's interesting with this is that even though it's model constrained in the sense that it's making a decision based around these 4 parameters that are based upon this modeling heuristic, it's really not actually model based. From the standpoint of the entity making this decision, it's simply taking these 4 knobs and turning them. And then that's feeding into some black box function that it has no knowledge of. And then that in turn is giving it some sort of reward. So in that case, it's mapping a series of actions it could take based upon the state of the system and to get a reward. This is while model constrained and model informed, still not model based, still is arguably model free. So let's go ahead and try to now incorporate this more explicitly, actually give our agent an idea of the world in which it exists. And we actually have a framework to do that, something akin to model predictive control. So taking some of the same sort of language and ideas around model predictive control, but kind of modifying it for our case here, what can we do? In this case, we can give our entity an estimate of the world around it, and then allow it to make its decisions based upon a forward-looking projection of the universe given its estimate. So this is sort of the pseudocode, somewhat poorly written. My apologies for those who are better at writing pseudocode than I am. But ultimately what's happening here is you assume some model structure, you calibrate that model structure that your agent assumes to the observed history thus far. And then given that, you optimize your future actions based upon your best guess so far about what the model is. In this case, this truly is a model-based process because your agent is making a decision based upon an explicit model of the universe, which it is iterating on. What I think is most interesting is it doesn't necessarily have to learn the truth about the world around it. In this case, these are some learning rates for the agent exposed to different sort of models of other teams. And these lines that are circled are showing where the agent learns a model of the universe that actually doesn't match the underlying behavior necessarily perfectly, but is good enough. It ultimately allows it to come up with sort of an estimate, a hypothesis about the world around it that allows it to make a better decision than it would have made otherwise. When I say that it wouldn't have made otherwise, I mean that quite explicitly, even in a situation where our single shot agent that I talked about before is still cost reducing, in this case 71% cost reducing, our model based agent is able to extract even more cost reduction. And more importantly, in environments in which our single shot agent is either mildly cost reducing or even sort of exacerbating problems by its presence, the model-based agent is still cost reducing, primarily because it can actually update its assumptions and sort of act on the fly to correct from initial poor decisions. This is kind of stated a little more directly and tabularly. What I think is more interesting is this actually then works even if there are some fundamental flaws in the assumption about what the world looks like. So in this case, let's go ahead and take sort of the underlying rules that are being applied. So in this case, our agent is still assuming that the universe around it is following the Sturman 1989 heuristic, but in reality, they're following related but fundamentally different rule from this Oliva 21 paper in which net inventory, reactions to net inventory change in backlog. And so the question here is, can you still get a reduction? And the answer is yes. So even though that the agent is sort of making a fundamentally flawed assumption about the nature of the universe in which it exists, the fact that it has some sort of estimate about the world around it and is able to fit that estimate is ultimately allows it to sort of adjust from initial poor assumptions and still act in a cost-reducing manner. Now let's go ahead and move into an environment in which we are truly becoming not even sort of model informed, but model free. So in this case, developed a dual DQ and network architecture. In this case, this is sort of back to that reinforcement learning architecture we talked about before. This is a mechanism by which we kind of can take states of our world, define state variables that we feed into this dual neural net, which has been coming up with values based upon both the state and advantage, and then combine them together. So in this case, it's trying to map actions to rewards, sort of independent of the environment in which it exists. It's a little bit more information about the nature of how this was constructed for those who are interested. What's interesting is by itself, this actually is also cost reducing versus sort of its absence otherwise. So in this case, this agent, even though it has no knowledge of the world in which it exists, is still able to learn a mapping from actions, from state action pairs towards values that allow it to reduce costs in the simulated environment. And then we can even go a step further and now start incorporating a little bit more of that idea of an estimate of the universe in which it exists. So now we're taking this model-free approach and starting to add some explicit model structure. So in this case, part of now what the observation set that goes into this dual neural net, this dual DQN, I should say, is an actual estimate of the model around it. So before we calibrated an estimate of our model and fed it into our optimizer for looking forward. In this case, we're doing the same thing. We're calibrating based upon history, coming up with an updated estimate of what the universe around it looks like, and using those estimated parameters for the ordinal rules of its neighbors as inputs into its action space. Again, this is actually generally cost reducing, but what becomes interesting is actually the model aware agent is a little bit less cost reducing than the one that's truly model free. So in this case, removing this sort of underlying order rule structure actually reduces the utility versus even our first method where we had an agent that was acting explicitly by using a simplified order heuristic rule and then fitting to that. This implies a bit of a trade-off in terms of the value of information structure and possibly even more utility though in more decoupled spaces, as you can see in sort of positions 2 and positions 3. This is something that I'm still investigating actively. I would love to talk more about to folks at this conference. Sort of shown a little bit more explicitly, this is now taking a combination of those various agents that we talked about before and now exposing them to a combination of bootstrapped, totally artificial environments, and then also fitted parameters from real players who have played this game in the past, both in the original 1989 configuration and more recently, just within the last year, for some semi-large, medium-sized games in 2021 and even a small game from the beginning of 2022. And what you can see here specifically down the sort of a base stock rule, which is your sort of classical optimally fit rule, is still surprisingly robust in reducing costs. Those triangles there. A single shot optimized agent is also cost reducing, but really it's that fully model aware agent that still is the most cost reducing consistently, and because of its ability to sort of correct for its own actions over time. So just kind of moving forward for the sake of time, I will point out that one thing is that this research so far, especially when looking at the dual DQN structure, implies both an ability to sort of maybe dive in this a little bit more to come up with a structure that works a little bit better. However, it does imply that such a more model-free, less constrained environment is more useful in these more decoupled positions in the supply chain, specifically positions 2 and 3. But it does raise some more questions. And what I still think is interesting is that a relatively simple heuristic-based rule, one in which an agent is optimizing, but optimizing against sort of these 4 parameters that come from an existing decision rule, is still really robust and quite cost reducing, even when compared to some of these more exotic neural net applications. But ultimately, what I want to get to here is that these methods do complement each other. As I said before, the DQN method seems to be more valuable under more noisy, more decoupled environments. And essentially those 2 middle positions have contributed the most in terms of real world costs in recent games as well. And the single shot and base stock approaches, the ones that were actually, model constrained, but still ultimately model free, are still shockingly robust, even against some more difficult teams. But that model based version is still the one that gives us the best outcome. Some notable limitations. This is empirically grounded, but not empirically verified yet. Something I still want to do is take this work and actually put it in the context of a real game. I imagine taking one of those players and replacing it with my laptop and seeing how that sort of affects folks. Then raises some questions about how people interact with these systems in of themselves. So I will say thank you. I look forward to talking with everyone else at this conference. And hopefully we get to see this iterate, and maybe you'll be sitting down at a beer game and I'll walk up behind you and pop a laptop in front of you. So thank you, and have a great day.